Good morning. I'll call the meeting to order. Once again, welcome to our new employees that are joining us this morning. It's great to have you with us, and you can learn a little bit more about what Commission does for the Port. I'd like a motion and a second for approval of the minutes of the regular Commission meeting of March 13, 2024.
I so move.
Any questions, comments? All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Curtis, good morning.
Good morning, Madam President. Ready for me?
I'm ready.
I also want to shout out new employees. Nice to see you all. It's been a long time, 6-7 minutes at least. Another great crop of new hires who've been here for everywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months. It is always nice for me to see and to hear the diverse joiners, and so I'm really excited to see them. Also, the best question askers, I'd say, even better than Dave Robertson's starting group, right, Dave? You got something to learn from this group. I would like to point out our safety champions for the month who are up here now from across the business. These are 4 employees who have trained their fellow employees, identified issues that came up in the course of daily business, done some IT programming to help us with our systems to monitor safety. So just a shout out to another great group of Port employees watching out for safety and watching out for each other. And with that, I would like to call John Acree, our Marine Director, up for our safety moment. John, you ready?
Yep.
I should say our newly minted Marine Director, John Acree.
Well, good morning, Commissioners, and I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to give this update. My name's John Acree. As my pronouns are he, him, and as Curtis mentioned, I'm the newly Director of Marine Operations and Marketing, and kind of wanted to just kind of tell you on the Marine side, you know, that safety is very important to us. I mean, especially for us, because we have so many representative employees out there working and, you know, doing machinery, climbing things and everything else. And kind of looking at the record, I'm pretty happy with where we're at on that for the accidents that we have. But I want to thank Steve Daniels for kind of helping me out on this. So we kind of got in and out of it. But what we have here is that, you know, we have 55 employees, you know, and that kind of take care of the maintenance for our marine terminals and then for our business and marketing duties out there. These comprise of our marine maintenance facilities. You know, that's most of our laborers doing the carpentry and, you know, electricians and so to speak. And then we have our marine security, and then we have our landscapers. And then we have just our kind of our marketing people and, you know, admin people. You know, some of the stuff that we're looking for, you know, we're really trying to hit the key metrics, you know, and kind of pushing the safety for the Port of Portland. And, you know, we're committed to the visibility of, you know, our leadership to kind of drive home safety. But, you know, one thing that, and Steve put it in here, and this is the big key, right? I mean, when we talk to our people out there, and it should be everyone, even when you're at home, you know, I mean, the thing is, everyone is responsible for safety. You can't rely on Steve or Andrew or someone like that to say, here's what you have to do to be safe. I mean, everyone has to take on the responsibility when you go out there. So, and you know, take that from work, take it to home. You know, I use that just this weekend. You know, I was changing a light switch, and I go to my son. I said, hey, I'm turning the power off. Tell me when it goes off in the office, right? And I was doing a lot of stuff. And so I went up to the office and I said, oh, that's not where I want to change it. Right? I wanted to change it in the bedroom. I thought, well, it's probably on the same circuit, right? And it had trouble with the light switch, so I kind of turned it on. And, you know, it's off. And then I thought, I should. And this is where, you know, we talk safety so much out here. I said, I really need to make sure, you know. And I did it. No, the power wasn't off, you know, so it was wrong. So anyway, so remember when you're home, everything else that comes into play. We went on this, and, you know, we have the safety management system, and you have your metrics and stuff like that that we follow, and it's a good way to track and keep us on track. And I sat down with Steve and kind of went over just to go over the metrics and see what we're really going to see where we can try to, elevate our safety out at Marine. And so he's been really good. Some of the stuff we've been tracking is that we have a weekly meeting, and it has all our, so it has MFM, our security, landscapers, amongst other departments, but safety's there as well. But, we're going to use that forum for, Andrew to really track our safety issues. I mean, you guys see the things that, what's open, where we're at. But, we're going to use that forum where he can really talk to the managers so we can track to see where we're on, so we can keep pace with that. So I think that's a good thing that we're doing on that part of it. I guess to say that, our big thing is that we're just trying to elevate safety in everyone. I mean, I think that's a top priority for everyone that we have here. And so I just want to say that, we've been doing good. We had in the last 2 years for landscaping, security, and our marketing department, we've had no incidents. We've had 3 at MFM in the last 12 months. And when you look at the incidents, and essentially we had 3, and the ones that we had listed here, when you look at it, one was carpal tunnel, one was a strain back from driving. So when you do that, but one was a little bit more, where they had hazardous material like in paint, and the guy decided to shake it, but it had a hole in it, right, and it went in his eyes. So I mean, those are the kind of things you got to take care of. So, but I just wanted to kind of end it once again and stress that safety is a priority, and it's really going to be a priority in Marine. I think we need to elevate it a little bit, and I think the other thing that we need to do too is that, like in all business and everything else, right, a lot of it's communication, and we need to communicate and build relationships, with our safety management teams and our employees, where, they feel working together, not for or against each other. You have to work together. So anyway, that's what I
appreciate it. Thank you, John.
Yep.
Thanks for coming in. I think the point you make about some of these things that get reported, we might not consider as extreme or as hazardous, but they are still things that we're worried about. We don't want people to go home with injuries of any kind. So thank you very much for sharing that. Commissioners, just 3 announcements this morning. First, I believe you all heard that last week we announced that August was to be our new opening date for PDX terminal. We're really trying to give the folks who are doing the work, 950 people out there, Vince, right now, doing work every day, give them the space they need to be safe. They're our friends and our family and our neighbors. And so just really making sure we're doing this in the right way. I've got to say, I've got full confidence in the team. It looks great out there right now. And I think the opportunity we've got here over the next 3 months to really get it right and have the opening be successful is just spot on for us. And I'd say consistent with our values and the direction. So I'm looking forward to it. I expect you all will be looking forward to it as well. And we'll get you the details. We are going to have a celebration out there. We're working on details of when exactly that will be in August. Second, we joined United Airlines last week for an opening of the reverted military hangar across the airfield. It was actually a long time coming. I believe the project, Dan, started in 2018.
That sounds good.
Roughly, right? It sounds even better than it actually is. But it's actually complicated to take a hangar that's in military use and put it into commercial use. But it will now be a site where United can do their maintenance, and we'll have aircraft coming from around the region to do maintenance here. So it's a great opportunity for us, additional revenue for the airport, and significant capital investment from United as well. I'll speak for Dan and the team. The impression of the team was that United is really focused on safety on site. I know it's been in the news a lot lately, but it was reassuring for us to know that they're really focused on safety here. And then finally, T6. We announced earlier this week that T6 will be open for another year. We are working with our partners out there at Terminal 6 to keep the container business flowing. Keith and his team have been around to 4 different meetings in the community with shippers, Aurora, Boardman, Albany, and Portland. We've got a lot of great support from the shipper community for the work at T6. It is really important, though, as we seek to negotiate a terminal operating agreement with a third party, that we get state support for that effort. We are asking for $8 million from the state through the emergency board. That is in May. We've had really, I'd say, successful and positive meetings with state leadership in that regard, but we're hoping that the state will show that they also are engaged and interested in the success at Terminal 6. So keep you posted on that over the month ahead. That, Madam President, is the conclusion of my remarks. Happy to take any questions. I know John will be happy to as well.
Great, thank you. Congratulations, John. Very exciting. Commissioners, any questions for Curtis? I have a motion and a second to approve the executive director report.
Second.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We're going to move on to public comment. And as always, I want to stress to anyone who comes to the port to deliver public comment, your comments are very welcome. We welcome you here, and your testimony is important to us. Commissioners, we did receive written comments from Blaine Ackley. He couldn't be here today, but I had a chance to read those last night, and you all received copies and want to make sure you get a chance to read those. And as a reminder, for those that are providing testimony this morning, I do ask that you limit your comments to 2 minutes. We will be keeping track, and as we hit the 2-minute mark, I will give you a gentle reminder that you're at 2 minutes. And we have two that are signed up to testify, Mickey Barnes and Sorben Garber. We'll start with Mickey. Mickey, good morning.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Good morning.
Okay, good morning, President Koga, members of the commission. Thank you for hearing my testimony. In 2016, Carol Smith was forced to resign from her position at Portland Public Schools as superintendent because of a failure of the district to address concerns about lead-tainted drinking water at various schools. According to a 2016 Willamette Week article, an independent investigation into lead-contaminated water in Portland schools found that the district cultivated a culture of willful ignorance, incompetence, deception, and an absence of diligent inquiry. In addition, the district was cited for failing to protect children's health and for failing to warn students and teachers, excuse me, about possible sources of lead poisoning. I raise this issue because it bears an uncanny resemblance to the attitude of the Port of Portland towards the lead poisoning and other environmental harms caused by fossil fuel burning activity at their airports. 6 months have now elapsed since I first came before this board requesting information about the amount of leaded fuel purchased, sold, and distributed at HIO and other port-owned airports. To assist in gathering this information, I was assigned a port staff person who informed me that due to a household crisis, she would be out of the office much of the time. Thus, beyond a few brief email responses, little substantive information was provided. As a result of this unsatisfactory response, I revised my request and presented it before this board on February 14th. The following day, I was instructed to submit a formal public records request, which I did. On March 29th, I received an email from the Port Public Records Department stating that the estimated cost for the provision of this data exceeded $3,000, and that my request for...
We're at 2 minutes, so if you can wrap up, thank you.
Yeah, and that my request for a fee waiver was denied. I just want to point out that this information should not require a public records request. It should be posted regularly on the port website. People have to make decisions about where to live, recreate, and raise their families, and they need to know the kinds of emissions that are being released by one of the biggest polluters in the state. I'm insulted by this. I feel like I want the port's policy of obfuscation and postponement in providing accurate data must end. And I want to restate again my request for a fee waiver and the release of this data without further delay. Please include my written comments in the port meeting minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Sorben Garber, good morning.
It's easy for them to change the time allotment.
He's muted.
Mr. Garber, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
No.
We still can't hear you. Mr. Garber, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yes. Good morning.
I apologize. Good morning, President Kova, Commissioners, Executive Director Robin Holt. My name is Soren Garber, not Sorben. Soren Garber. I'm a Portland resident and a transportation planning consultant who's been providing professional services to the port for over 2 decades. And I wanted to alert you, in case you didn't already know, that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has begun its environmental studies of dredging for the lower Snake River dams. And one of the alternatives they always look at is whether they should be breached or not. Why this is important to the Commission is why this may be important to the Commission, as it has been in the past, is that this would make the Snake River non-navigable, would force a lot of grain products to divert to very non-cost-effective modes, and likely also to divert to Puget Sound ports. This happened about 20 years ago when the port hired me and my team to look at that. Washington State the legislature has just initiated this study. They have not invited any Oregon jurisdictions or organizations to participate, except for tribal nations that go outside the border. I would just suggest that the Commission and port staff keep an eye on this. Try to see if you can get some other Oregon partners involved, as you did in the past, to make comments on this, because should the river become non-navigable, it would have a severe impact on our lower Columbia River ports, as well as for farmers and other shippers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Garber, and I'm sorry I mispronounced your first name. Next time I'll get it right. Thank you. Anyone else care for provide public comment? All right, we will close public comment and open up our agenda item on general discussion. I'm going to ask Antoinette to come up. I think we have a special guest this morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you, Commissioner Kova. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's really with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce Josh Lehner to you all. Josh is our senior economist with the state of Oregon. He's responsible for developing the state's economic forecast, the outlooks for employment, income, and for housing. Josh also serves as de facto vice economist, forecasting state revenues related to lottery, tobacco, and the judicial department. And what's pretty fascinating about Josh is his research has been cited by The Economist, the Financial Times, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, where I like to say where all the news is fit to print. Just to name a few. So I will say, Josh, that I am an avid follower of your research, and I appreciate all that you do for the state, because it certainly has helped to inform my thinking around the state economy and how we think about, this year's budget. So I appreciate you being here today. And with that, I will turn it over to you to present to our commission board.
And Josh, I just want to say good morning. Hello. It's great to see you and welcome.
Thanks, Katie. It's great. It's great to be back with the commission here, and just here to share some thoughts on the current economic outlook for the state, with a bit of a focus on maybe the supply chains and the distribution and the freight movement, of course, which is so important for port operations and the like. And so if we go to the first slide, please, we've been in this inflationary economic boom, which has largely been pretty good, good economic growth, good income growth, things like that. But of course, the inflation has come along with it, and the cost of production, the cost of, servicing equipment and buying new, and the expansion projects and all that sort of stuff, right? The cost of those have gone up significantly at the same time, right? And a year and a half ago, economists were really pessimistic about the medium-term prospects for the economy, because we've never seen an inflationary economic boom really kind of slow down without a recession. And so the last year or so has gone pretty much better than economists could have hoped. Inflation slowed from near double-digit rates to basically 2% for the second half of last year. And so that was significant progress in cooling inflation much quicker than anticipated. But, the Federal Reserve was holding off, not cutting interest rates. It's going to be a bumpy path. And sure enough, the first couple months of the year, we've seen inflation tick back up. We just got the March Consumer Price Index, CPI data this morning, and it continued to be hotter than expected as well. And so, again, we're not out of the woods yet. Inflation has slowed meaningfully, but not all the way down to the Federal Reserve's target. So exactly when they begin reducing interest rates is kind of up in the air again. They were saying maybe in June, maybe with the data this morning that pushes it off to the fall. But overall, we're still seeing progress, and the underlying strong economic growth has continued when it comes to GDP, personal income, consumer spending. There's been no real weakness in the labor market. The labor market has cooled. Job growth has slowed. But the reason job growth has slowed is both because nearly everybody who wants a job has a job today with a very, very low unemployment rate from a historical perspective. And then, businesses were also probably worried about the recession risk as well. And so they held off on hiring. And so the chart on the right is looking at the hiring rate, or the job vacancy rate through two different measures, one coming from our employment department at the state. They do their own survey, and then the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a federal survey. And you can see the job opening rate has really come back down. It's roughly in the range of where it was pre-pandemic. So the concerns about the labor market being overheated and like the ongoing strong wage gains have started to cool. To what extent that would just mean inflation is higher, permanently, so to speak. Those concerns are fading, and so the prospects for the economy remain good, solid, above average, I would say. But inflation is not all the way back down, and we'll see how that progresses in the years ahead. But the Federal Reserve is probably going to hold off making meaningful rate decisions until they see some further progress on the inflation front. If we go to the next slide, please. This is specifically regarding supply chains and movement of freight and things like that. We've seen this divergence. You guys have seen it as well, where chart on the left is just looking at consumer spending, right? This is adjusted for inflation, so it's kind of getting at the volume of goods, physical goods that U.S. consumers are purchasing, right? It certainly skyrocketed early in the pandemic. We were stuck at home. We're getting our Peloton bikes. We're getting everything delivered to our doorsteps and not getting out. And then it just maintained, right? It's held steady. It's grown on a volume basis from a consumer spending perspective. But because we had the snarled supply chains, once some of those started to normalize, a lot of stores, a lot of businesses and retailers in particular ended up being over inventoried, right? They had too much product. And so they were doing price reductions. We've seen a lot of the major multi-state, national firms talk about their inventory challenges in recent years. And so that means even as consumers kept spending, maybe because of the high inventory levels, we didn't need to produce as much stuff and ship as much stuff to the stores because they were working through their backlog of inventory. And so what we've seen is spending has been strong. We look at industrial production output from the manufacturing sector. It's been pretty stable. employment in goods related industries like manufacturing and transportation and warehousing has been pretty steady. We've started to see some layoffs in Oregon from e-commerce related distribution centers. Not a lot. It's still significantly higher than it was a few years ago, but that job growth has certainly stalled out. And even we've seen some layoffs within the sector for some of these reasons. And then we've seen the actual movement of goods decline, which I know you see some in the, whether it's air cargo, marine cargo, or things like that. And then here we're looking at weight mile transactions. This is the Department of Transportation, ODOT's. In Oregon, we don't, truckers don't pay the gas tax. They pay the weight mile tax based upon the size of the truck and the weight and what the implications of that would be for road maintenance and things like that. And you can see, again, we had a huge surge in weight mile transaction movement of freight early in the pandemic. And then it's really come back off, and it's looking like where it was a few years ago. And so this has been that dichotomy, that difference between a strong economy, strong consumer spending, and then some of these other things that typically move with the economy, like the weight mile transactions, really dropped significantly more than anticipated. Looking forward, looking for modest, slow growth. From ODOT forecast you can see in the chart, but upward, right? Because the economy is still in expansion, and if we're in an expansion, that means the American consumer is spending like we always do, and that does mean as those inventories normalize, we're going to see more products needing to be shipped and moved closer to the consumers. And so it's been a big difference. It's been surprising to what extent we've seen this difference, but I think we're seeing more reports about normal levels of inventory at a lot of stores, so that should support more movement of freight in the years ahead. If we go to the next slide, please. I'm going to go quickly over a couple of points. They're important, but the nature of Oregon's economic growth is shifting relative to what we're used to doing, right? You think about economic growth, if you think about it from a textbook perspective, it's really labor and capital. It's how many workers do you have in your economy, and then how productive is each worker by sector, by average, by occupation, all that sort of stuff. And the labor market is tight for good reasons, cyclically strong. Here we're looking not at the unemployment rate, but the employment rate, the share of people that actually have a job for this prime working age cohort. And you can see we're at or near an all-time high in Oregon's recorded history. And encouragingly, this strong recovery from the pandemic from an economic perspective has been inclusive. Typically, we see a lot of these things that we care about as a society, where when it comes to differences, socioeconomic differences by race and ethnicity, by age, by educational attainment, by the urban-rural divide, all of these sort of things that we care about, they tend to widen during a recession and then only start to get better as the expansion continues. That hasn't been the case with the pandemic, which is good news. A lot of these disparities, they still exist. They're still meaningful. They still impact lived experiences for Oregonians across the state, but these differences are smaller today than they were 3, 4, 5 years ago, which is certainly good news. You can see here employment rate differences between our white neighbors and our BIPOC neighbors is smaller today than it was in Oregon's modern history. So labor market is cyclically strong for good reasons. The business cycle continues, the expansion continues, but it's also structurally tight labor market because of demographics. As the baby boomers continue to age into their 60s and their 70s, we've seen an increase in retirements. That's going to continue for the decade ahead, just demographically. And so it's going to be hard to find workers for that reason, and it's really challenging to replace retirees. Obviously we know that in our agency when Katie left. And so, and we're seeing it in our office as well, as we've had some retirements. And it's just challenging because these people have a lifetime of experience. They're exceptionally knowledgeable. And it's hard to replace that. Even if you can find somebody to replace them, they have to get trained up and learn on the job and figure it out. And so that just takes some time, and it's a challenge at the micro level, the business level, and from an economy-wide perspective as well. We'll go to the next slide, please. So the other side of this is capital. And this is something that Oregon has done much better than the average state so far this cycle. The output per worker, the productivity gains per worker have been really encouraging. And so we've seen the slowdown in our population numbers, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the productivity has offset that. And so we've seen good growth in Oregon economically, but it's all about this productivity gain and output per worker, which is good news. It raises wages. Faster productivity gains can help with faster wage gains as the workforce is more productive than they had been in the past. And I think there's good reasons to think that we'll see stronger productivity gains in the years ahead. One of it's the tight labor market. Businesses, if they want to grow, they're going to have to get better productivity because the labor market is tight. And also investments in infrastructure and expansion projects, and of course upcoming chips and science related investments in semiconductors that'll have a big impact in Oregon and in the Portland region in particular. And then other things like more businesses operating. New startups bring new products, services, efficiencies to the marketplace much quicker and more, better than a lot of older firms. And so that's going to be good news for the economy in the years to come. And then, of course, potential speculative impact of generative AI can make office-based workers more productive as they can focus on the tasks that matter more. And maybe they don't have to focus so much on some basic research and writing activities and things like that. That's kind of where AI is standing today in that respect. So I think the outlook here is good news. From a regional perspective, certainly from a productivity perspective, given all of these things are stronger here locally than they are nationally. Go to the next slide, please.
Josh, can I ask a question before you
Please.
move on? This is very interesting. If we can go back, is there a correlation? You are looking at employment rates across the state, and then we've broken them out for Black and Indigenous. Is there a correlation between employment rates and unemployment rates within those groups? And is this targeting a particular age cohort?
The employment chart was targeting a particular age cohort, 25 to 54-year-olds. It's called the prime working age demographic, usually. And the reason is simple for the fact that, you're out of your traditional schooling years. So we're ignoring teenagers and the very youngest adults just because of the school decision can impact those numbers, not because they don't matter. And then you're cutting off at middle ages because then you start to get into the early retirement decisions. So this is a group that, 80%, 85% of them are working. And then the other 15, in a good economy, and the other 10, 15% are staying at home to take care of the kids. And that's about it, right? And so that's one reason why you focus on that group. We've seen increases in participation in employment among older adults, 55, 65, 75 years old. And then we're starting to see rebounds in teenage population as well. So there's certainly a relationship here. The difference between the unemployment rate and what matters and the employment rate is it's about that participation decision. Are you actively looking for a job and can't find one, so you're unemployed? Or are you kind of going on with your life, helping out with the kids or whatever the case may be? And then when you see an employment opportunity, you just take it. There's no unemployment stage. You're like doing something else and then you take a job. So like that participation decision is the difference. And it's not that that's not meaningful. It can be hard. It can just be harder to interpret at different points in the business cycle. So that's one reason why we focus on the employment rates. It's a very, cut and dried discussion in that sense.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. An update on where Portland's regional economy stands, right? This has obviously been a hot button topic in recent years. The narrative can get really pessimistic, in my experiences talking with folks. And so I think we need to step back and think about a few things. One, there are differences locally compared to some other large metros nationally. There's some more pronounced differences from the urban core recovery in Portland compared to the suburban recovery locally, nationally. That's more pronounced, right? Where Multnomah County and certainly the urban core when it comes to working from home and office vacancy rates and things like that, that's more pronounced locally than in the typical large city nationwide. There's no doubt about that. From a regional perspective, from the broad 7-county metropolitan region as it's officially defined, Portland is right in the middle of the pack. Jobs on the left, so a little below the middle, not perfectly at the median out of all of the large metros nationwide, a little below, but not different from a lot of other places. You could say somewhat similar on the population numbers on the right, where out of those same sort of large metro areas, Portland's population over the entire pandemic cycle is doing better than 25, 26% of them, right? So it's not closer to the median like the job numbers are, but it's bottom in the 25th, 26th percentile or so. So not the worst performer, but not super strong either. And again, this is different, right? Especially last decade, coming out of the Great Recession and the financial crisis, it was the large urban areas in the nation that recovered first in 2010, 2011, 2012. The growth coming out of that was driven in almost entirely by the nation's large areas. And Portland was one of the fastest growing ones last decade in the entire country. Clearly not the case this time. Large metros are lagging, broadly speaking, and we're not at the top of the pack like we were last decade. When it comes to population, the other thing to note would be in 2023, the new numbers came out at the county level just a couple weeks ago. The Portland metro area basically treading water in 2023 with barely any change to the population at the metro level. That improvement from the population losses in 22 moving into the stability in 23 is driven by two things. One is that the losses on the Oregon side of the river got smaller. You can see the Multnomah losses, were closer to 0.5% in 23 compared to 1.5% in 21 and 22. The Oregon suburban areas, Clackamas and Washington being the largest ones, of course, basically moved to zero as well. No longer losses, but moved closer to zero. And then the ongoing gains on the Washington side of the river being maintained. So the Oregon losses got smaller, the Washington gains stayed similar. And so that improved the metro level population numbers from declines to stability year to year. And then the last thing to note about the Portland region, when it comes to income growth, either overall income growth or on a household basis, median household income, Portland's income growth has been almost exactly in the middle of the pack nationally. So jobs a little below the typical metro, income perfectly in the middle metro, and then population, slower than that, but not the worst performer. So that just helps frame the discussion of the challenges that we face in Oregon economically and growth moving forward. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is really going to be the crux of the issue from an Oregon and a regional perspective in the years to come, because this is different than we've seen before, right? Where the population in Oregon really has only declined twice in our modern history. Once was in the early 1980s. Again, we had high inflation in the 70s, high interest rates, high mortgage rates. The timber industry restructured. We lost a lot of jobs at that time, and people packed up and left the state because they couldn't find work. And then the other time would be today, potentially, in the census data. The Portland state data doesn't show similar declines. They show very small increases versus the declines in the census data. And this is different, right? This is not an economic catastrophe. We did not lose a bunch of jobs and then people had to leave the state to find work. This is a strong economy today, and maybe we're losing population as well. And so that's a different dynamic than we're used to, certainly. And so we have to be open to the possibility that the future does not look anything like the past, that these migration patterns have maybe permanently been altered. And our office buys into that to a certain degree. You can see our population forecast here moving forward is for slow, modest increases, 0.6%, less than 1% a year for the decade to come. And so that is different. You can see past cycles, 1.5% population growth was pretty normal. And so we might get that again. That would be some upside risk and would be meaningful upside risk to the economic outlook for the state. We don't think that's the most likely scenario. And so whether it's, entirely due to our terrible housing affordability, people packed up, and when they leave Oregon, basically everywhere else they move, as long as it's not, California or Seattle, everywhere else in the country is more affordable. And so everywhere, they're leaving for more affordable locations. I think that's the crux of the issue. It could also be working from home. It could also be anything else that goes into it. Humans are complicated, right? We're trying to decide what is the best place for me and my family. What are those opportunities look like moving forward? And so there's a lot of things that go into that. Some of it could be tax policy, social policy. Some of it could be, weather related, family related. You want to be near the grandkids, or you want to move for school, whatever it is. It's a complicated decision, but it's clearly that housing affordability is one of the major underlying factors related to these migration decisions. And so we also have to realize that maybe even this modest growth we have in the baseline, which I still think is the most likely scenario, right? We're still an attractive place to live. We still have the scenic beauty and the second paycheck effect of living in the Northwest. And we have a lot of job opportunities, right? Young people move for jobs. And so that would be a key dynamic moving forward. We think we still maintain a lot of that. I think growth should be expected. But it might not materialize. And so for the last year and a half, our office has been working on this alternative scenario where we're calling it zero migration. What happens to the economy if this population gains don't come back like we anticipated? What would that do? Long story short, we have a report on our website, but the long story short is the economy wouldn't crater, right? With inflation, with wage gains, with rising asset values over time, income and consumer spending will certainly increase. Right. And demographically, we have a lot of demand as those millennials are still entering into their higher household formation years and things like that. There's a lot of good things to come. It's just the raw number of people wouldn't grow like we thought it would. And so that would have some impacts, and they don't really matter year to year, so to speak, but they really start to accrue 5, 10, 15 years down the road if we don't see migration rebound. So it's not so much an immediate disaster. It would just put us on a slower growth trajectory in the years to come, which is something that we've tried to model through and think through. I think I got one last slide. And it's related to the housing discussion. Like I said, I think housing affordability is a key issue facing all Oregonians. We're all paying more relative to our incomes than in most other places in the country. It certainly is impacting our lowest income neighbors to the greatest degree. They're the ones who are least able to afford it because they don't have as much income as other folks. And so this is an issue that challenges all Oregonians. And moving forward, we're hoping to see better housing affordability due to an increase in supply, right? The crux of the issue is we haven't built enough housing. And then once we can maybe solve the market-wide supply issues, then we really are starting to talk about those targeted needs, which of course policymakers care about already and have for years. The targeted needs for those who are least able to afford it and with the most personal challenges and working through some issues to, get back on their feet and things like that. And so the policymakers have passed a lot of things in recent years designed to help increase the supply of housing. The one thing I would note here would be the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis that has been in the backgrounds in recent years, but has really been brought to the forefront in the most recent legislative sessions. The thing to know there about our office is we're written into this law. We are producing a set of housing need estimates by city, by local jurisdiction, by the end of the year. It's going to be out in the fall, late fall, and it's going to talk about number of housing units needed and targets set based upon need and income levels. And so that'll be the first step. Next step next year will be implementation through DLCD, working with cities to work on the production strategies and zoning capacity and all that sort of stuff. And then in the years to come, we'll be see whether we are hitting those targets or not, and then what to do about it if we're not. So again, this is a long run process. It took us a long time to get into the housing crisis. It's going to take us a few years to start to get our way out of it. And so that would be something to keep in mind, is just coming in the pipeline. And again, to the extent that improved housing supply and production helps with affordability, that helps our neighbors, that helps the economy produce, more jobs, more production, that sort of stuff. And to the extent that affordability is the underlying driver of some of the migration trends, better affordability would revive migration trends in the years to come, which, if that occurred, would raise the overall trajectory of the state and regional economy as well. So there's a lot of positive things to come out with helping our neighbors, growing the economy, and improving the long-term outlook. And so I think hopefully we'll make progress on this in the years to come. It's just something in the pipeline now, and our office is involved in the data. And so if you see this in the months ahead and you want to talk about it, let me know. If we go to the next slide, last slide is just my contact information. I'm always happy to chat. Reach out at any point. I'd be happy to help out as best I can. So thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Josh. It was excellent. A lot of information, needless to say. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Nemi.
Thank you, Madam President. I just have a comment and reflection. I really appreciated calling out the impact on the economy and just overall services and quality about when long-term employees leave the workforce. I often hear long-term employees almost dismissed and a desire to hire new people and the next generation of folks. And I think it is a really important time that we're really recognizing what those long-term employees really can bring to the workforce. And one of the articles that I read about the mistakes and the safety issues up at Boeing actually called that out, that there had been a turnover in the workforce during COVID. There had been buyouts. Folks had, taken taken voluntary severances and some folks had just retired, and that they think that that had an impact on the safety and the training and other folks. So, just appreciated that, hearing that reiterated here as well, and something for us to think about.
Comment. Thank you. Josh, do you guys ever look at travel tourism numbers, or do you really let Travel Oregon do that?
We do in circumvent ways when we're particularly asked, and given certainly the local regional numbers, and track the hotel occupancy numbers a bit, and certainly in the urban core, just trying to gauge those recoveries again, trying to what is different about local stuff versus the trends more broadly. And so, but it's not something we do on an ongoing basis. Travel Oregon does it. ODOT has the vehicle miles travel data as well. So that's kind of where we look to when we're asked about it.
Thank you. Commissioner Sampat.
Yeah, related question. The ODOT information is interesting and very good. But in terms of exports that might be driven either by air or marine, is there a projection that you do in terms of what to expect?
We don't have any forecast for exports, right? So we do monitor them, we do track them. And of course, as you know, the challenge is volume of products versus the value of the products. And a lot of what we export here is very, very valuable products, but they don't weigh anything. And so that kind of makes some of our numbers more challenging to look at than others. And then other things like some of our timber exports, our log exports are routed through other ports that aren't coming from Oregon. They might be Oregon products, but they're routed through other ports, maybe on the river or things like that. And so it can be a little bit more challenging, but certainly we've seen, broadly speaking, we've seen a slowdown in globalization, right, in the last handful of years, last decade for sure. And so that increasing level of globalization and trade has sort of stalled out. And so that's certainly, I think, a broader macro global trend that's worth noting. And then the other thing I would note is there's research coming. I haven't read it. I haven't seen it on sort of West Coast ports and consolidation and changing of shipping lines or routes and things like that. I've seen an announcement that research coming, so I'm very much looking forward to reading that this summer when it's available. So once I see it, I'll flag it and pass it along.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I mean, globalization patterns are changing. We talk about reshoring, friendshoring, different buzzwords, and of course the impact of the CHIPS Act. It'd be very interesting to see what your office is seeing and get an analysis around that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioner Alexander.
Josh, first of all, as always, it's fascinating to sort of hear you go through this analysis. And I'm delighted that it has a very different tenor than it did 2 years ago when you came in front of us, and we were in a much better position. And I'm curious as to how much of where we are to now is sort of contingent upon what we've watched happen versus what we have made happen within the state. Again, it's that unanswered question about what's next, but it's either we're curating it or we're witnessing it. And I'd love to get you a sense of that.
Yes, Commissioner, that's a really tough challenge, right? Because a lot of times,
that's why they pay me the big bucks.
and because a lot of the things that we think matter are decades in the making, right? In terms of things like livability and the reasons why people would want to move somewhere. And yeah, there's great job opportunities, some of which maybe took some public policies to do, or certainly the work to till the land and get the roads infrastructure in place and that sort of stuff. And then the other things related to public policy that would set the stage from an educational perspective and a livability perspective, all that sort of stuff. Right? Like that's just like baseline activity that accumulates over time to make your region attractive. And so identifying exactly what and when did that is usually pretty hard. There are more technical ways you can analyze things, like in a shift share analysis, about like how much of your growth is that broader trend happening everywhere versus an increasing competitive advantage where you're getting an outsized share of the gains or a minimal share of the losses, that sort of stuff. And so you could do that by sector. I haven't done that lately to try and look at that, but that competitive advantage is certainly a key factor. And we see that in some industries, you know, our historical strengths in timber and semiconductors and tech and that sort of stuff, right? Like those are still strengths of ours today, at just as much as they were relative to the rest of the country a generation ago. And so I think recently with the pandemic change would be e-commerce and warehousing and distribution. That is something where Oregon has traditionally seen smaller shares of the overall trends in market, but we certainly made up for that in the last handful of years with large distribution centers being opened across the state, particularly along the interstates. And so that would be something where maybe we lacked a competitive advantage. And so in recent years, we've gained a competitive advantage, but that's kind of just made us look more average now as opposed to underperforming.
So Josh, I believe you have a hard stop at 10:25, correct?
Yes, I have another event to get to.
Which would be now.
Yeah.
So thank you again for your time. We might have to invite you back sooner than 2 years. It's a great topic. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.
We are more than welcome to continue to opine on economic stuff if you want. Antoinette, anything that you want to add? Or good?
No, Josh covered it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll touch on it a little bit in the budget intro comments, but yeah, he covered it well.
Commissioner Strader, did I miss you? Did you want to make a comment? Okay. All right. Our next topic, Keith, come up and talk to us about the latest on Terminal 6.
Good morning. I'll try to be quick. That was actually really good context for what you're going to see in my slides. So these slides are what we have shared out with a lot of the shippers that we've been meeting with. I'm going to take you from the 30,000-foot Josh discussion down to about 1 foot off the ground of what's happening with the container business. Next slide. So I know I'm going to preach a little bit to the choir here. I think you all know a lot of what I'm going to share. But a question we get of, why do you stay with a business that has not been financially feasible or sustainable for many years? And the reason is simple. This is important trade infrastructure. It provides jobs. It's critical to an economy that is trade-based. And Josh hit on a lot of that. So this was an excerpt from a letter that Curtis sent to the Legislative Ways and Means co-chairs during the short session. Next slide. So how did we get here? And one of the things I've been telling folks, I've been working on trying to fix this issue of financial sustainability at T6 for 15 years now. And it's probably been the number one area of focus, kind of up and down for me during that 15-year period. And our Marine team has been working in that space the entire time as well. And I just want to shout out to John and his team. When you create such an uncertain cloud over your staff, and yet they still come to work every day and they try to solve problems, it's amazing. And they've done such great work, especially over the last year. And you'll get a good sense of that from the rest of what I'm going to present to you. But yeah, why do we do it? It's Oregon's only container terminal. Shippers need it. If you care about trade, you need to care about container infrastructure. It takes trucks off the road. It's a more efficient way to transport products. It's about as simple as that. We're more of an export economy than we are import, but you need imports for equipment to come into your market that can be used for exports. So it's all a circular supply chain. 1,500 jobs last year. We shared with you the latest economic impact analysis, the snapshot. The 1,500 jobs, that's a low number. Typically, we're probably 50% of our capacity at Terminal 6. We're really rebuilding a business that took a hiatus in 2017, 2018, 2019 post ICTSI. So that's a lot of jobs at about 50% of capacity. So it's worth fighting for those jobs. $20 million of tax revenue. I know you're all aware of Oregon's imbalanced tax structure. The state is the big winner of all of that economic activity through income tax revenue. And unfortunately, the port's a bit of a loser because the only subsidy we get is from property taxes. And that amount shrinks over the years because it got capped during the 1990s. And so we're about 4% of our overall operating revenue is coming from the tax base. And yet we're generating so much income tax revenue that we're frankly not capturing. And that's the challenge of the general fund going forward that I'll hit on a little bit more. Some of our constraints here, we're a river port. We're in a mid-sized market. So why does that matter? You looked at Josh at those slides that showed consumer demand during the pandemic going up, then normalizing. Same exact thing happened with our volumes at T6. It spiked during the pandemic and now it's normalizing. But one of the challenges we have is our imports are pretty small relative to the other major markets on the West Coast. LA Long Beach, Bay Area, Seattle, Tacoma. And yet we really need that direct import service coming into the market for the equipment for exporters. And so it's really important that the importers like Columbia Sportswear, and thank you, Rochelle, for your support, and thank you, Columbia, for being a ongoing supporter of T6. It's important that those importers speak to the carriers about the importance of coming directly into T6. Very easy for importers to just let the cargo flow through other gateways. It's not a huge cost issue, but for exporters, it's huge. And so that's the challenge that we've got. River depth, 10 years ago, I would probably opine that the river depth issue is going to make Portland, which is a niche port, get more niche over time because ship sizes keep going up and the depth of the river is 43 feet, and that's not going to change. It's a little different today. What happened during the pandemic is we not only got a lot more volume coming through T6 with SM line, but MSC came. And MSC is the largest carrier in the world, and they have large ships, they have medium and small ships. But they're now bringing 12,400 TEU vessels into Portland, and we always were thinking 7,000 TEU vessel is about the largest that we're going to get coming up the river. So now what we're seeing, it's not so much depth of river, it's really the reach of the cranes. It's modernizing the terminal itself to be able to work two very large vessels at the same time. So the capital program is responding more to these larger ships that we really didn't expect could come into Portland, but they are. And now we're going to have a capital investment response for that. That's part of what the future in working with a terminal operator is focused on. Vessel transit, we're 105 miles from the river. That's very unique. All of the West Coast ports are sitting on natural deep water. They're inside harbors, but depth is not an issue and transit time is not an issue. So the operating costs, we have double pilotage. We have bar pilots to get over the Columbia River bar for really good reasons. And these are very talented people that bring those ships into the Astoria area where a river pilot takes over. So all the vessels that come up and down the river are twice piloted. That's an added cost. That's a disadvantage when we're talking with carriers. We usually make up for that on the land side, on the terminal, on the rates and charges on the land side. But where's that balance? I think that's the key. And then more specifically, what happened to us, again, during the pandemic, I'll even go to the years ahead of the pandemic, post the ICTSI lease. Happy to get into any further background if you're interested. Hanjin bankruptcy, ICTSI lease comes back to us in 2018. We assembled an industry leader committee, 21 members, led by the Port Commission. They came up with a whole new strategy, and our team has been implementing that strategy ever since. But that strategy, the key part of it was don't put all your eggs in the container basket. You've got 200 acres, have break bulk, have intermodal services, and have containers spread out the revenue base so that you're not just going up and down with the container business. And we were very successful for the first few years, but when we lost the intermodal service, that's when you're going to see a pretty dramatic hit on our financials. Next slide. All of this, but a lot of our stakeholders did not. So I have to remind people that you can't use airport revenue for non-airport uses. Antoinette's going to pay me $20 after this for saying that. $50. Perfect. That's good. And the areas that you see and that are highlighted, we've gone through a major restructure. Those are all the verticals that are now reporting to me. And then, of course, aviation reporting to Dan Pippinger. But a lot of folks have asked us, the port has always struggled with the financial issues with the container business. Why are you calling the question now? And the response is that when you look at the future of dredging, when you look at the future of lower Willamette cleanup, both of those issues are unfunded legal obligations that show up in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And when we start to forecast the general fund, it doesn't work. The math isn't working. And fixing the container business isn't going to make the math work either. We are going to have to make the case that all of this economic activity is worthy of investment from public sources, especially the state. But why now? It's because those two issues in particular are calling us to start making some tough choices on how we spend the capital that's in the general fund. Next slide. This is the kind of the bottom line slide, kind of dramatic shifts. So you see in 21 and 22, we were doing well. From a T6 standpoint, losing $5 million, we're good with that. Our other lines of business in the marine, so the autos, the bulks, those are all landlord leases. We make lots of good net revenue, and we are more than willing within that portfolio to subsidize moderate losses in the container business because it is important. What we can't do is what you see in 23 and 24, and what happened in is it follows exactly what Josh was talking about, which is the run-up of consumer demand, the glut of trade that was happening, and the backlog that was happening in the supply chain on the West Coast. Gave us a lot more volume. It woke up the terminal, showed us we were able to do things that we never dreamed. We were doing Chicago service with intermodal rail. We were doing our rail shuttle up into Seattle and Tacoma. We lost all of that when the market normalized, and that hit us so hard on 23 and 24. Yet we were still obligated to terminal use agreements, and with both SM Lines and MSC, those terminal use agreements lapse at the end of June this year. So that's been the rally cry for the team. In 2023, we saw that this is exactly what's going to happen, and we've been essentially working really hard ever since then to mitigate, not letting it happen in the next, the 25 budget, which is not yet the segue, but exactly what Antoinette will describe when she talks about the budget. So next slide. So what are we doing? We're all the logical things: cost reductions, revenue increases, state assistance, and third-party lease opportunities. Next slide. John and his team have done a very good job of taking some hard choices. We went from a 5-day gate to a 4-day gate. Our shippers are not happy with that. We got earfuls around the state in those meetings, but everyone understands. And so we're at a 4-day gate. We have 200 acres. We have enough activity for half of that. So more efficient use of the yard. That helps with a lot of our labor costs and equipment costs. We have major berth dredging project that would be in the budget that Antoinette is going to present. We are deferring that. Major IT project, we are deferring that. So anything major that we can defer during a year of transition, we're going to do to save money. And you'll see that in the budget. All right, next slide. Next slide. So the big, I would say, sorry, back one. The big, I would say, breakthrough has been with the carriers themselves. And I want to thank Commissioner Koba and Commissioner Luther for going and traveling with Curtis and I and John to Korea in December and to Geneva in January and make a pitch. And it was more than a pitch. It was, we're going to have to shut down in June if we aren't able to create a much better financial scenario. And we knew we weren't going to close the whole gap through rates, but we knew we had to make a significant skin in the game of the future of T6 impact with the carriers. And it's been, really great to get the positive response. We now have new rates. They are materially higher than they were before. They reflect the carriers stretching out and helping us keep the business alive. They believed us that we are looking at a shutdown without moving to the rate level that they've agreed to. And with that, it has allowed us not only to feel confident that the carriers believe in this market and believe that T6 is a viable port call, but that we can then go to the state and look at legislators in the eye and say, we really believe in this as well. And it allowed us to take the request from 10 million to 8 million. And that's where we're at now. So next slide. So the short legislative session, we made the pitch with the Ways and Means Committee. Unfortunately, did not get the funding, as Curtis said in his opening comments. We are rallying the community now. We are in full mode with doing a lot of outreach with legislative leadership, and we've gotten good support for an e-board action in May. The problem with May is that the decision to extend for another year has to be made right now. The shippers and carriers are right in the middle of negotiations. So we're making a bit of a bet that we are going to get state support. And so the two things that are critical for us moving forward is the 8 million and the next slide. So long-term, the business model, and I know you all know this because you've heard me talk about it. There is no port authority on the West Coast that directly operates a container terminal. And there are very few port authorities in the United States that operate a container terminal. They are all landlords. So the landlord model of operating is the right model, and we are an operator out of necessity. And we have got to find a third-party operator to take the risk of this business. It requires a long view. It's infrastructure. And it needs someone that is in the space of, that has a carrier network that can drive more volume into Portland and is willing to kind of ride the waves that go up and down and has kind of the capital appetite to be able to make those long-term investments. That's really the future. And we need a new long-term lease, and we need time to get that put together. This is certainly, as you can see, this is a risky business, and it is valid for anyone to say, why should a private operator make money when the port has not been able to make money? We also know, though, that we are a very inefficient operator. Not only are we a public agency, this is our only container terminal. All of that overhead gloms onto that one operation. Most operators have lots of operations to absorb that overhead. We have to hire a terminal operator to manage labor, and they mark up that management fee. That's a very inefficient model as well. So there's a lot of work here to do, and but we wouldn't be here and be making the pitch for another year if we didn't have some optimism about coming out the other side of that year with a successful partner on the other side that can take this operation and turn it around from a financial standpoint. So next slide. Just these are the shipper meetings. You know, when you look at the community, it's all, not only was the journey that we've been on over the last year brought me hope around the carriers and around terminal operator conversations, but most importantly, the shippers have not given up on T6. T6 has been up and down, and it's been a hairy beast for a long time. But we got lots of great feedback and engagement, over 200 folks throughout the industry and throughout the state. The picture that's not up there is when we were in Boardman, upriver. And so this is a community that is ready to support. We've asked them to support in two ways. Commercially, if a carrier needs, if you can use a carrier out of Portland, use the carrier out of Portland, especially this year. And then politically, we need your voice. And we've asked them to do all of the legislative outreach and letter writing and so on with legislators. So it is a bit of a full court press between now and the end of May with the Oregon legislature. But it feels like there is a collective action that's happening here that's, I think, going to be very successful. I have really covered these points, and I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Questions, Commissioner Devon?
First of all, Keith, I want to commend you. This is incredibly detailed and difficult work, and I think you've outlined the risk and the potential rewards of this, and I want to commend you and your team for all of this that you've done. And I have a brother-in-law who's in the oil services business, and this thing about riding out risk and having the stomach to do so, this is an inherently risky business and very similar to his. And so I think you're exactly thinking about this in the right way. I want to shift a little bit. I can't help but talk about, I think, what's been in the news in terms of shipping is what happened in Baltimore. I'm a Washington, D.C. native, and my family also lives in Baltimore, so I've been over the Francis Scott Key Bridge 1,000 times. Does this represent an additional risk, given that you talked about some of the carriers now are bringing in large ships with large containers? I've learned a lot about the makings of the footings of the bridge in the last couple of weeks, and what kind of risk does that represent for us, especially in this year of transition?
Yeah, it is definitely the hot topic. In the 12,400 TEU MSC vessel was in the New York Times. Was it Washington Post or New York Times? Yeah, the Times article. And we've got the Astoria Bridge, and we've got the Longview Bridge. And so it's certainly the hot topic in the river with the pilots, with the carriers. I don't have anything specific to add other than the trade is definitely talking. And when you're in a river with bridges like we are, it's even more of a hot topic.
Yeah, so it's a bit of an unfair question because I'm asking you to put on a civil engineering hat, but I was curious on what you had heard and what the community was talking about.
Yeah, then they're definitely talking about it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you, Commissioner Luther?
Good, good. So thank you very much. Incredibly complicated, and I know how much time and effort you and your teams have put together to be thoughtful and address this in a responsible way. So thank you for that. A question about assuming that there is a third-party lease that comes into that facility. Have there been discussions about, especially if they're bringing their own ability to bring their containers into the operation, of a return to the intermodal service, or is that sort of gone and forever, or with that volume coming back, do we expect that might come back?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think that the beauty of what happened during the pandemic is that we created intermodal. We created a Chicago, SM did a Chicago service, which we hadn't done a lot of that before, did a little bit. But having that gateway where you're taking import cargo for the United States and sending it to the Midwest is something that T6 did and demonstrated that it can do very efficiently. And we had the shuttle that moved up and down I-5 to the other ports in Seattle and Tacoma. All of that was done, and it was done well, and all of that can be done again. It's always just a question of the dynamics of the supply chain at the time. It's equipment. It's what's the cost of trucking right now? What's the cost of rail? And the carriers are always weighing how they want containers to flow to them by the shippers all the time. And they're kind of running that math. But what I love about what we did do during the pandemic that we were never able to demonstrate, even back in the day when we were looking for leases before, is intermodal. And I think that unclogged, uncongested gateway into the U.S., into the heartland of the U.S. is a big advantage for us.
Commissioner Strader.
Keith, I wanted to thank you and the whole team actually for all your hard work. Antoinette as well. I know this is a difficult situation we're in right now. The market itself, just really trying to even understand it as far as shipping goes, has turned on its head in the last 10 years. It's just been a complete paradigm change. So it's been a struggle. Obviously, we have our challenges just because we are we're not a deep water port. We're that transit distance that comes up there, so we have those challenges. But I really appreciate the fact that you guys have really leaned into the fact we are a niche. We do have strengths looking at the intermodal, some of these other opportunities, as well as to recognize the advantage to the local community economically. Every dollar that comes in through there, those get magnified. Those are turns of that dollar that stay in that local community here. The other advantages to the state itself and the tax base, people kind of lose track, but we generate $20 million. We do have an $8 million ask, but you do the math, it comes out pretty simple. In 1 year, they're going to make $12 million on that. And that, if we keep this running, works in perpetuity. So I just really have a genuine appreciation for all the hard work that everybody in your team has put into this. Thank you.
Thank you. And, one of the other things I'm going to say that is a strength for us that never used to be, it's labor relationships and it's productivity that's been demonstrated now over several years. And it's a lot of our relationships that we've developed with ILW in particular since the days of ICTSI that's now a strength, whereas it was a big risk for us historically.
Commissioner Sampat?
Yeah. So Keith, I really want to add to what everybody's been saying here, which is, the team has done an incredible job in a very difficult environment. So kudos to them. It's managing a P&L, but it's also stewarding a critical asset for the region. And we saw that in the pandemic in terms of, reducing supply chain risk for the country as a whole, because we had this asset. But thank you for all the work, and hopefully we have somebody who can bring intermodal back, because that seems to be the key to unlocking this and getting to kind of sustainability. Thank you.
Mr. Alexander.
Just a quick comment. I want to also applaud the work that's been done. It reminds me of a phrase, never waste a good crisis. And we were certainly looking at that. And I think just the creative thinking and collaboration. And then I also want to react just to the tragedy at Francis Scott Key. Years ago, I worked for a behavioral health firm. And after 9/11, the first calls that we got were from Oklahoma City that had gone through its previous trauma. And I think this reminds us of the risk associated with that work, but also of just the emotional outpouring for folks who are in this space as well. We learn, they learn, and hopefully as they heal, we will as well. So thank you, guys.
Any other comments, questions? Onward and upward.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank
Keith.
you.
You sure you don't want to stay up here? For
I'm done.
Now for the item we've all been waiting for. Dun, dun, dun. Antoinette and Fran and budget.
Come on out, Fran. All right. Well, thank you again, commissioners. Keith has taken up at least 3/4 of my words, so I'll try to be as succinct as I possibly can be. But before I do that, I really do just want to also acknowledge Keith and his team and how I have been able to work collaboratively with this executive team, thinking through how we get to the other side, right? And the importance of, as I've characterized it to the executive team, some patience, some focus, and executing on the right financial plan. And I think we are definitely on that path and have set ourselves up to get to the other side and hopefully get there successfully together. So with that, I am going to, I just want to take just a few minutes, and I'll be brief, to introduce this budget and talk about a couple of themes that I think will be resonating as Fran gives her presentation. And then I'll pass it over to you. The agenda for today is, she'll go over the outlook of the business. She'll touch on some of the stuff that Keith talked about, so to have some more clarity for you all. And then get into the budget. We'll talk operating and capital, and certainly be prepared to answer any questions that you all have before I'll turn it over, and then we'll be prepared at the end for questions. So as we were thinking this year about the budget, thinking about the economic backdrop, thinking about, again, some of the themes that are emerging for us, a couple of things come to mind that I want to make sure I share with you all, because I have to look at both sides of it. We talked, about the marine side, but I'll start with where we are just in terms of employment growth. And over the past couple of years, what we have observed is coming out of the pandemic, we kind of bayoued back, and then we started to level off over the past couple of years, hovering somewhere around 8 million. This year, we are budgeting about 8.4 million in employments. And there are a few factors that are driving that. I would say, we've been focused on the activity around evaluating the business and international travel and what impact that's had on us moderating at around this 8 million in employments. And then also we have to be cognizant of what's happening industry-wide, just in terms of constraints, I'll say capacity constraints that were impacted by whether it be delays in potential aircraft across the industry. Safety obviously has been a challenge. It has certainly impacted the industry in Portland in particular. And so with all of that, how do you shape, a budget? So that's a theme, and you'll see that incorporated in how we got here today. On the marine side, I think Keith just absolutely nailed everything that you all are going through, and just fortunate that I have a chance to come to work with someone like him every day. We've done a considerable amount of work. Well, he may not think that when I'm saying no, but yeah, but there you go. But I mean that. But we he laid out for you all the work, what the strategy is, the game plan, and the only thing that I will add to that is some pre-work that we did. We've been doing over the past 18 months or so, really tightening up our general fund forecast. And doing that so that we can have, again, the focus, the discipline, and the accountability. And so last year's budget was our baseline for looking at that 10-year forecast and saying, how are we going to frame our budget around this? And then we're doing it again this year and setting some pretty conservative targets. And we're doing that, and the importance of doing that is making sure that from a financial perspective, Keith has laid out all the benefits around the economic, the economic importance of this asset. We also have to balance just the financial responsibility around that, around some of those decisions. And so we have to be conservative. We have to be prudent around how we set those targets. And Fran is going to talk a little bit more about just the progress that we've made, from aligning around the forecast, developing our budget annually around the forecast, and then just reporting out and being disciplined around it and seeing us make decisions differently that improve our financial performance. So I couldn't be, more delighted about that. So lastly, I'll say, let me just a couple more things. I promise, Curtis, no dissertation here, but I'm on a roll. So the other thing, primary objective here around the budget, this year, it was about resource allocation, just making sure that we were acknowledging the realities that we're facing, the slower growth around the air traffic activity. And again, I talked about ensuring that our targets are consistent with our forecast. And again, that's all about looking at the short and long term and making sure that we perform and deliver financially. And then I'll briefly touch on the importance of you all understanding that even though we're doing this delicate balance around shaping this budget, we still want to make sure that you all understand that we have strategic priorities that we have to fund. And I want to make sure that I touch on how that shows up. So my last thank you is just across the board as we set some pretty conservative targets around cost control, and then also making sure that we maintained our FTEs. We pretty much asked the organization to remain flat around FTEs for this budget. So I just appreciate, again, the collaborative effort across the organization and people understanding where we are, and just having the patience and the fortitude to work through that and have that reflected in this year's budget so that we, again, our financial responsibility is always at the forefront. If we could, I just want to spend just 2 seconds really quickly talking about, if we could go to the next slide, around our strategic priorities. Next. Here we go. I won't belabor this. You all can read this, but with any budget, like I had mentioned before, it's just always good to have a a reminder of what our strategic goals are, and then how this informs our thinking and how it shows up in terms of resource allocation around our budget. And I'll just point a couple of things out. I think our terminal core project is obvious, but I also want to make sure that you all know and understand that once we open up this beautiful edifice across the street, this transformational project, we have to be squarely focused on continuing to step up our game around customer service and thinking about ways that we can be innovative in the airport and help us to deepen our relationships with our partners in a way that helps us kind of think about how we want to drive more activity or contribute to driving more activity, air traffic activity. We're investing, and I'm just delighted about the work that we're doing around T2 and that mass timber. Just want to bring to your attention that we are committed to that. Direct ties around economic development, but also shared prosperity, right? That shows up in the work that we're doing there. So we're continuing to fund that. Again, Keith talked about where we are with trade and our movement of goods. And then lastly, before I turn it over to my partner here, Fran, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we were talking about the development in this framework around we're committed to shared prosperity. How do we think about evaluating that from a budget perspective, right? So in other words, we're committed. How do we spend, and how do we kind of quantify that? How does that show up in our decision making? And so we, over the past couple of years, started with just some questions around what does that look like? And then we've developed that, I think, in a much more sophisticated way and put together a budget equity framework and a tool. Fran's going to touch on that a little bit, but I bring that up because I can remember in a meeting with Michael Alexander, we were talking about just these basic questions around leaning into shared prosperity, how equity shows up, and how that translates in our budget. And he said, well, how are you going to quantify that? And I was like, I don't know, but we figured it out. So we've done some yeoman's work on that. So I hope that you will see how that shows up in the seriousness of how we want to demonstrate accountability around equity, particularly as it relates to our budget and how we allocate resources. So I said I wasn't going to talk a lot, but I did. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fran to get into all the good stuff around the budget. All right, Fran, it's it's all you.
Good morning, commissioners. Maybe we should just go to the last slide since I think we've kind of covered everything. Just kidding. Before we get into the outlook for our business lines and get into the detail on our operating budget, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Just want to touch on our port-wide full-time equivalent positions. As Antoinette mentioned in her introduction, this budget season and last budget season, we've been laser focused on our general fund forecast and really linking our annual budget development process to our long range financial forecasting. And that goes for the PDX side as well. Every time we do a bond issue, we develop, a long-term forecast, and that ends up in our official statement for the bonds. So that's really driving everything on the general fund side of the business and the airport. So total FTEs port-wide, the proposed budget version that's in front of you today, we're only increasing FTEs 7.41%. That's relatively flat. And you can see, the increase is really all in the PDX business, and that's just a result of bringing a new terminal facility online. The version that will be in front of you in May, actually the FTE increase will only be 4.4, only 0.5% increase. So 3 of the positions that are actually in the PDX budget today are going to be filled with existing vacancies. So, we'll see a slight decrease in our personnel expenditures. All of the rest of the changes are really kind of movements in or out of PDX, so I'm not going to get into the detail there. Next slide. For PDX, activity, here we're looking at our enplanements on the left, passenger landed weight in the middle, cargo landed weight on the right. All of the lighter blue bars are previous fiscal year actuals. And then, from left to right, fiscal 24 budget, fiscal 24 projection, and then our fiscal year 25 budget. So, this kind of came up in Josh Lehner's presentation, and also Antoinette mentioned this in her introduction, but on the enplanement side, you can really see just activity is leveling off. We're stabilizing, between 8.5 million enplanements. We're forecasting 8.4 million for fiscal year 25 budget. That's only 3% growth over our current fiscal year-end projection of 8.2 million. I think it's possible we're being a little conservative with that 8.4 million projection. However, I think the upside, from what we've heard with all of our partners that we work with to develop this forecast, I think the upside is probably 8.6 million. So maybe closer to 5% growth. But really, right, it's business and international travel that just still are not recovering. Specifically on the business side, it's that north to south traffic that hasn't returned. Like if you look at kind of PDX's West Coast O&D traffic, that's down about 27%, and that's kind of our proxy for that north-south traffic. And then on the international side, it's kind of a mixed bag. Transatlantic activity that has surpassed 2019 levels. We're doing really well on that side. It's our Trans-Pacific traffic, travel to Asia that has not rebounded. So our air service development team is working really hard on that. Passenger landed weight, we're forecasting 9.3 billion pounds for fiscal year 25. That's almost flat with our year-end projection for fiscal 24. All of the factors I've already talked about on the enplanement side are impacting that, as well as just the aircraft fleet. There's, constraints there for the airlines with aircraft delivery. So that's impacting that forecast as well. And then cargo landed weight, you kind of heard from Josh and his economic overview, sort of a little bit of a freight recession. We're really just seeing, e-commerce growth slowing. We're really returning to kind of our pre-pandemic levels, forecasting 1.9 billion pounds here. Kind of seeing not necessarily cargo reduced in the region. It's more shifts in modality. And we're also seeing just some of our carriers shift to smaller aircraft. So that's kind of what's driving the decrease in the landed weight. Next slide.
A quick question.
Oh, sure.
If I just if we can go back, passenger activity, the forecast for 25, is it all impacted by sort of recent occurrences with Boeing Transit and investigate? I understand weight and I understand enplanements, but bodies, you would think if there's any trigger, that might be the space.
A couple of things. So if you look at our fiscal 24 budget, we were forecasting 8.5 million enplanements, and we're projecting to end the year at 8.2 million. That is primarily impacted by the MAX 9 issues. So, Alaska and United are kind of two of our big 5 airlines. I think that impacted probably 5% of their daily operations at one point. So it had a huge impact on our forecast for this fiscal year. The winter storm in January didn't help. Next slide. So our financial summary for PDX, I'll focus really just on the key metrics, not so much the actual kind of movement on revenues and expenses. But for our fiscal year 25 budget, our airline cost per enplanement, around $26.60, an increase of $6.30, about 30% over our fiscal 24 budget. And that's really tied in with our airline cost center net requirement. That's forecast at about $225 million in fiscal year 25, an increase of about $60 million or 37%. You're really seeing both of those two key metrics increase together. And if you look at that expense chart, you see the debt service and coverage that's increasing almost $60 million. And that's all the Series 29 issuance for TCOR that is all online in fiscal year 25. So that's just the primary driver there. That's also really what's driving the increase in the airline revenues on the chart at the bottom left. And then finally, port cost center income. We, pay close attention to this. It's our primary pay-as-you-go funding source for port cost center capital projects. In fiscal year 25, estimating port cost center income at $55 million. It's a decrease of $6.5 million or 11%, but that's really distorted by just the application of our ARPA federal stimulus funding dollars. So if you kind of take that out of the equation, our port cost center income is actually increasing about $1.5 million. Kind of better rental car revenues and premise rents offset by slightly higher O&M expenses and slightly lower parking revenues.
Mr. Luther has a question, and commissioners, please feel free to ask questions as we're going through the slides.
I appreciate the conservative approach because I think obviously for all the reasons we've discussed, that makes a lot of sense. Ever an optimist, I'm just curious about under the theory of, build it and they will come type of approach. If there is upside that starts to trend, are there clear strategies for deployment of income or revenue in a sustainable or responsible way that you have upside plans? I'm just curious how the port, let's say that the Delta flight comes back to Asia, employment start to pick up, the draw of the new terminal draws a lot more people. What's that internal plan look like and how to deploy that unanticipated revenue?
So I'll try to answer this a couple of different ways. So I think from an operational standpoint, we clearly have taken a conservative posture here in the budget, but from an operational standpoint, to the extent that we needed to expand as we start to really see the growth expanding maybe more rapidly than we're showing here, we are prepared to step in and be able to do that. Dan says often to me, Antoinette, I have to be prepared to operate this airport, and we need to make sure that there's some flexibility to do that. So I think the way we're currently positioned now, we can certainly do that. We've talked also about how we generate revenue here at the airport. And so as we are particularly generating revenue from lease and also from our landed weight, there's another way that revenue is generated inside the airport we call non-airline revenue. So to the extent that we start to see more traffic there, we'd have an opportunity to see some upside in the concessions. Obviously, it impacts our parking as well. So as that continues to improve, then I think just it would be natural for us to then be able to loosen up the purse strings a little bit to be able to fund that growth, right? I do want to go back, though, to a question I think Commissioner Alexander was asking around kind of that difference between 24 and 25 and why we're taking this a little bit more of a conservative posture. And we really talked about a couple of things around this, which one was how much of this, how much of our airline traffic is impacted by just these shifts and what has been caused from the disruption of the pandemic. And the reason why that I think is important, because it leads to the second point, which is this isolated? Is the slowness of us or moderately growing back really isolated to the pandemic and just that disruption? Or is there something structurally that may be going on? And we do believe we will come back. It'll just be, much slower than we had anticipated. But for now, we are seeing that travel patterns have changed, right, with remote work. And so some of that, we just have to be cognizant of that. If that shifts, we definitely, I think, have a structure where have the agility to be able to respond to that. If that hopefully answers the question. Okay.
I have a question. The debt service number, the 181.6, are you expecting that to hold steady now for the next few years, or it will continue to go up?
We have one more issuance planned. We'll be going to the market later this summer, and that will be the final issuance for funding the remaining portion of Terminal Core. So fiscal year 26 and 27, we'll see another bump in debt service and coverage.
I think it's about 20, depending upon where we end up pricing this summer, where we lock in rates, about maybe 20 to 25 million. So it just depends. But we forecasted that.
Questions? Awesome job, by the way. But just a couple of questions. There's some modest increases in personnel and material and services. And I'm assuming those modest increases are pretty much what you're considering holding flat in personnel.
On the personnel services side, so, we do have, of course, some FTE increase from fiscal year 24 to 25. But we also, just on the personnel services side, have merit increase assumptions for our admin staff, and then kind of depending on the represented group, their, contract rate increases, and then benefit and PERS increases. So all of that is kind of what's driving the personnel services. Materials and services, a significant portion of our PEX operating expenses are labor contracts, so custodial services with Relay Resources, our SP Plus staffing for the shuttle buses, parking garage, the toll plaza. So, just like on the personnel services side, you see increases there. We do have some manning changes between fiscal 24 and 25 associated with the custodial contract, and some with our SP Plus staff, just as the operations change. So those are really the primary drivers there.
Yeah, I think you guys have done an awesome job in trying to build a budget from bottoms up. But I think my question is really centered on where are the efficiency opportunities to hold flat, and are those already built into the numbers, or do you see future opportunities to maybe manage the modest increases?
I'll take a shot at this, and then if, Dan has anything he'd like to add. We went through a lot of rounds with this proposed budget, and a lot of back and forth with the operations staff. And what they're proposing here are, I think, they're really trying to kind of balance maintaining service levels for a really good customer experience at the airport, but also kind of reducing our cost profile, since we are looking at so much debt service coming online, and that's impacting our airline partners. So I think what's in this budget, there is a little bit of moderate risk around service levels that folks are going to try to take and see how that goes as we open this new terminal and get used to the new space. So I'll stop there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
No, it does. And Dan, and I want to commend Dan, and I had a great discussion with his team. They're awesome. I love what I saw yesterday. I think there is a balance, there's a risk, that you have to kind of bake into it. But I think my real focus is just making sure we're looking at true efficiencies, and looking for those opportunities. And it sounds like you guys have done that already with a little bit of balance of both.
Commissioner Johnson, just to add one other thing that we did this year, and we'll carry it out, I think, more broadly across the rest of the organization. And I'll focus on PDX in particular. When we went out and asked the organization to hold FTEs relatively constant, one of the other things that we looked at was our vacancy rate, and looked at just vacancies across the organization. And so we focused primarily on Dan's area, and we went through and spent some time just thinking about open positions, how we anticipate using those open positions, is there any opportunity maybe to resource allocate somewhere else, or maybe even just close that position down, right? And really, when I talked about earlier, right sizing, and trying to shape the organization and the budget around what we believe is kind of, we're in this holding pattern of this new normal until we get back to our 2019 levels. That's another way that you can look at it. And so we'll take that. So instead of adding more FTEs, let's look at what we have vacant and make sure that we're optimizing those vacancies. We'll do that across the organization as well, because there may be some additional opportunities where we can rethink that. And again, reallocate those resources where we have the need. This kind of comes back to your question around how do you think about ramping up, right? In the event that we boomerang, and this is one time I hope I'm wrong, right? That we do actually boomerang and come back much faster. And so through the management of those FTEs, that's one way you can do it. So.
Okay, next slide. So switching gears to our marine business and the activity outlook here. This similar layout to our PDX activity summary, although the prior year actuals were just showing a 3-year average, so fiscal years 21 through 23. Looking at our auto line of business, relatively flat at 363,000 autos, relatively flat to our fiscal year 24 projection. But I do want to point out, you can see that's, 33% increase over our prior year actuals. And the primary driver there is just increased General Motors imports at our T6 AWC auto facility. And that's been really good financially for Marine's operating income before depreciation. Autos is a very positive contributor to the Marine bottom line. And we are also seeing an increase in fiscal year 25 in Toyota's autos, about 10% up from our 3-year average of actuals, but relatively flat with our fiscal year 24 year-end projection. For our T6 container yard, what we're looking at here is actually the number of boxes, not TEUs, which is sort of the unit that Keith was mentioning in his T6 update. So looking at only about 59,000 boxes in fiscal year 25. And I just want to point out here that the decrease kind of from our prior year actuals, it's really just losing that intermodal rail service at Terminal 6. So, and there is a little bit of a drop in demand. Like we've lost kind of some of the 53-foot container business that kind of boomed during the pandemic. But, fiscal 25 relatively flat with our fiscal year 24 projection in terms of activity. Grain bulk line of business, we've really seen steady declines in volumes at the Terminal 5 facility. We're really kind of becoming more of an overflow facility here. Columbia Export Terminals primarily uses their elevator at the Port of Kalama. And mineral bulk up almost 15% compared to our fiscal year 24 projection, up about 15% compared to fiscal year or prior year actuals. Really the impact in fiscal year 23 and 24, we just had a partial year where Berth 503, where we handled potash at the Terminal 5 facility, that catwalk collapsed, their conveyor system was down. So we're now projecting a year of being fully operational there. Next slide. So our general fund financial summary, kind of going straight to our operating income before depreciation for the fiscal year 25 budget. We are estimating a loss of $7.6 million. That's an improvement of about $3 million or 27% over the budget we brought before you last year. And really that's a result of improved financial performance in both the marine and our trade and industrial and economic development divisions. And just kind of want to, connect that back to the rigor we're, applying to our financial forecasting, really working with the business teams on their strategy, linking these with our budget process, right? And so in the Marine division, you can see we're improving from a loss of 3.4 million to 1.2 million in fiscal year 25. A couple of drivers, I'm not going to go through each of the lines of business that we walked through on the activity side, but this budget reflects the higher pricing at our container yards. So that's one reason for the improved OIBD compared to our fiscal 24 budget. And then our auto line of business with the just continued increased volumes. And then we also have a fair market value adjustment going into effect for one of our auto tenants. And on the trade and economic development side, just the team really continues to focus on maximizing asset use. And this budget, I just want to point out, there are significant investments both in the Terminal 2 Mass Timber Campus on the operating side, and also you'll see when we get to the capital slides as well, we're making significant investments in the T2 campus. But there's also funding in the operating budget for our work out in East Multnomah County and engaging with the community there to kind of inform our economic and development strategy. Navigation, looking at a $6.7 million operating income. You'll likely see some changes between now and our adopted phase. We have not yet really finalized our operating assumptions with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, so we don't typically have a great picture of what that dredging schedule looks like until after this hearing. General aviation, looking at a loss of about $800,000. As a reminder, on the general aviation side, on average, we break even on an operating basis in that business. But in the years where we do have a shortfall, it's our port cost center on the PDX side that covers that shortfall. That's the one exception where, we kind of can break that brick wall. Back to the financial structure slide that was in Keith's update earlier. And then T4 and other environmental accruals, that's really our Portland Harbor Superfund business. We're looking at a loss of about $12 million in fiscal year 25, relatively flat with the current fiscal year. The focus continues to just be advancing remedial design and our allocation process.
Can I just add one more thing? Yep. Can we go back one more? Can you go back one more? I just want to point out to you all, and thank you, Fran. She did a great job walking you guys through where we are with the general fund. I just want to make sure as we continue to come before you guys with financial updates, when I talked about the general fund forecast, one of our key targets is to get OIBD positive, right? So the target we set was basically, hey guys, let's get to zero. And then let's figure out, with business plans and working through and making modifications to our forecast, how we even improve upon it from there. So I plant that seed because we'll probably be coming back to that conversation as we show you progress towards that target.
Thanks, Antoinette. And on the environmental accrual, can you remind me, obviously that number reflects what is, reasonably predictable at this point, but are there milestones where that environmental accrual, either within this budget cycle or shortly thereafter, where that accrual might be revisited and that number looks very different?
Yeah. So let me try to answer that two ways. So what we have, if you look at our financials, what we've accrued on the books now, I'll double check this, but I think we've accrued about 50 million so far. When we get closer to knowing, according to GASB 49, what's probable and estimable, that accrual on our balance sheet will grow. And then what you will see is we start moving towards actually doing the work. You'll see that reflected in our income statement when we expense that work. So, yes and yes, and we probably should. I want to make sure that we circle back with you and spend some time. We're happy to do that, kind of walking you through that balance between where we are with the accrual and the expense, how they're tied, and then how we're projecting the trajectory of that growth and that change over the next few years.
Next slide. So just final piece on our operating budget. We just wanted to sort of spend a little time talking about the budget equity tool. So Antoinette mentioned this in her introduction. This is sort of the second year that we've deployed the budget equity tool. We partnered with our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging team this year to really kind of actually start mapping individual line items in the budget so that we could start actually reporting out rather than just sort of asking individual business unit managers questions. So we're really just trying to get intentional about applying an equity lens as everyone is putting their budgets together. And we've identified, 4 categories, which are shown here on this slide: supporting small businesses, creating an inclusive workplace, and facilitating kind of equitable community engagement and sponsorships. So just a couple of things to note here. This is sort of the first year that we've really kind of done this work as an organization. So you see here, this is probably only 7.3 million of 340 million of our total operating expenditures in the budget. So I think it's safe to say we're underrepresenting what is actually a proposed equity spend. So we're just kind of want to point that out because this is meant to be an iterative process, build on it next year. We also next year really want to focus and sort of shift to deploying this same tool to our CIP or capital budget process as well. And I point that out just because that's where the magnitude really is on our capital budget side, a little less so on the operating budget. So I think I'll just stop there and open it up to questions if folks have questions on this.
Yeah, right, good, thank you. And this sort of goes back to our previous discussion of, where are we going and how will we know when we get there in terms of tracking this. I like this. I like the fact that it can be trended over years. And hopefully it can be associated more with growth than a cost center. Yeah. That's the concern, when I begin to see this work isolated, is that it's viewed as a cost versus an asset. And I do think we have the opportunity to frame it that way. So I think this is a very good start and interesting to see how it trends over time.
Thank you. Commissioner Sampath.
I just want to build on what Commissioner Alexander said. So this is the expense side. Is there a model in terms of capturing kind of outcomes and value, an ROI on the equity budget?
Not yet, but Keith reminds us regularly that we need to be thinking about it that way. Mm-hmm. And so we are certainly, we're starting to move a small group of people. I convened a small group of folks, friend, that was last week, to dig into this very issue and think about when we make an investment. I can take it back to T2. We make an investment. How does that really translate? From a financial perspective, we can do the ROAs and the ROIs all day long. But when you talk about the indirect impact, the jobs, the lives, and how equity shows up, and we're super intentional on the front end of that, how we actually quantify that, capture it, and then how do we visually show that to you guys, right? So we are a work in progress, but we're on it.
And I appreciate it. It's a hard problem. Not a whole lot of people have tackled it terribly well. So we'll look forward to more discussions in progress. Thanks.
Mr. Lamb. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. And I think that's having these programs, intentional investment. I think looking back, we're all gonna, end our term, but looking back, we can say that was intentional investment. And I think that we can we can't really measure by dollars, but we can measure on programs and the number of lives we impact. So please continue to set aside this budget and also share with us the programs that are executed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Any other comments from the commission? All right. From a process standpoint, we're going to open up a public hearing for comment on the proposed budget, and Antoinette's going to correct me.
No, I'm not
Okay.
actually. I have one thing. I can't believe I forgot this. I just want to thank my super amazing, fantastic team, because this was a total team effort all the way around. So I'm going to take a page out of Don Staley's leadership book, Go Gamecocks, right?
That's right. That's my alma mater.
Go Gamecocks. I want, if our finance team is still here, you guys stand up, because they just took care of business this year and just did an amazing job. And so we can't do anything well without them, right? I can sit here and smile, but that's where the magic happens back there. So I just want to give them some super recognition, and I just appreciate them so much, and I'm so grateful to have them. So
Kudos to all of you. Thank you. So back to the exciting process part. We're going to open up a public hearing to see if people have any comment on the proposed budget. We will not vote to adopt the budget today. That will come back to commission in May. So you do have a chance, if you have further questions, or to reach out to Antoinette and her team. That's all right with everyone. Given that, I'm going to open a public hearing and see if there's anyone that wishes to comment on the port's proposed budget. Right. Public hearing is closed. And as I said, we won't take any action on the budget today. We'll be back in May to talk about it again. All right. Thank you very, very much. Thanks, team. Our last action item is the Port of Portland Contracting Rules and Contract Review Board rules. Woohoo! Myra, good morning.
Appreciate that. Morning, everybody. It's Chief Share Prosperity Officer. I'm here to introduce the next item. As you know, at the end of each legislative session, there are amendments and revisions that happen for contracting rules. So when once a year after that's done, our procurement and legal team come together and they identify items that basically impact the Port of Portland, and they start doing a review and due diligence process to see what do we need to adopt and how do we need to revise and amend our contracting rules. And at the same time, they also look at the Port Contract Review Board rules, and then look at, they try to pair if there's any other things that need to be amended and revised as well. So because of that reason, today we have Kendall, who is the Equity and Contracting and Procurement Manager, that's going to present some of the proposed amendments for, for us to implement. So thank you very much.
Can you all hear me? How about now? There you go. All right. The green light was on, but never fails to just throw me off my game. All right. Thank you, Myra, and good morning, commissioners. Again, Kendall Foos. I have my pronouns in she and her. I'm here today to request approval of two items. The first being our contracting rules, and the second being the contract review board rules. Although both of these combined rules are driven by a legislative process and rooted in those laws, the Contracts and Procurement Business Unit finds so much added value to them as they promote consistency, transparency, and most importantly, equity and fairness in the contracting process here at the Port. Without these types of rules, agencies such as the Port could be challenged in protecting the public against wasteful or maybe even favored use of public funds. I represent a proud profession that serves as stewards that take those rules and shepherd them for the agencies that entrust them with such an important role. The public procurement professionals are custodians of public trust and are dedicated to ethical practices. As the equity and contracting and procurement manager here at the Port, I'd like to say what a joy it is to lead this work and the talented group of people here. I'd like to start by providing a brief background, excuse me, for the contracting rules for our newer commissioners, and for longer standing commissioners, hopefully this is just a reminder. The Oregon legislature establishes the various statutes within our public contracting code, specifically the Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 279A, B, and C. They can be revised in any given legislative session. The Port adopted their contracting rules in 1999, composed of these statutes from code, and have since revised them 9 times. In addition, the Port maintains our own set of Port-specific rules. The code requires the agencies that maintain their own contracting rules to review those every time the Department of Justice releases their model rules and determine whether the agency should look at modifying those contracting rules accordingly. The Port has reviewed the Department of Justice model rules, updates, and the Oregon Revised Statute changes from the legislative sessions 2021 through 2024, and staff now wish to update the contracting rules. Next slide, please. Okay. Because ORS, or the Oregon Revised Statutes, and the Port-specific rules are a bit lengthy, I wanted to call out a few changes to specific sections. These had wide support from the public procurement community, and they should have notable impact to the Port. The first changes small procurement thresholds for goods, services, and construction from $10,000 to $25,000. This portion of the statute allows the award of procurements in any manner that an agency deems practical or convenient, and the most popular is a direct award. This process is efficient and productive. The second changes the intermediate procurement threshold from $150,000 to $250,000. Intermediate procurements for goods and services in the Oregon Revised Statutes requires contracting agencies to seek at least 3 informally solicited proposals or quotes. Awards may be made to an offer whose quote or proposal best serves the interests of the Port while also considering price. The efficiency of the intermediate process is of benefit to the Port. It utilizes moderate levels of formality to uphold the principle of open and fair competition. The intermediate threshold increases the ports to once again use moderate levels of effort to conduct a competitive process for the engagement for moderate levels of compensation. We've heard a little bit today about the rising cost of goods and services, and so therefore the buying power at the lower limits wasn't as strong as it was in the past, right? So these newer limits more accurately align with the current market conditions. The last notable change that I'll mention on our contracting rules today eliminates the requirement to hold cash retainage from certain public improvement or construction contracts in a separate escrow account. The Port welcomes this as it creates an opportunity for less administrative burden, and the contracting community did support this. Next slide. Next, I wanted to just elevate a few of the changes to our Port-specific contracting rules. The first is for A185, and this change allows the Port to consider more core Port values, such as shared prosperity, when considering its options for the disposition of personal property that is no longer required for Port use. We hope that one of the outcomes that this will allow is creating a more defined pathway for donations to our community, such as to schools, nonprofits, or even smaller businesses in need. The second is to Port Rule B500, and this change simplifies procedures for selection of personal services. This change reflects current business practices and is of benefit because it reduces the redundancies in our rules. Lastly, I wanted to mention that the ORS change that eliminated the requirement for cash retainage and escrow made Port Rule C570 obsolete, and therefore it has been deleted. Next slide. Now I'll shift gears over to our second rule set that has undergone revision that I'm seeking approval for today. This is the Contract Review Board rules. Under the code, the commission must act in its capacity as the port's contract review board, or the CRB, to approve revisions to the port CRB rules. For some of you, this is your first time acting in this capacity as part of the local contract review board. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to tell you why these rules are important. These rules are additional port-specific rules that direct contracting processes and decisions. The CRB rules are essential to help provide clarity and efficiencies for the department and its function. On May 14th, 2014, the Contract Review Board approved the latest version of the CRB rules, and they have served the port well over the last decade. The revisions being presented today are really just to keep the rules fresh. I wanted to highlight a few of those for you now. The first is to our existing rule 8.8 that enables the port to award or renew contracts for information technology related hardware, software maintenance, or upgrades without competition under certain circumstances, such as when utilizing pre-existing knowledge from the port's current provider and when that's critical. The rule creates efficiencies and allows the port to optimize its IT systems. The revisions we've proposed clarifies the scope for the market-driven changes in the IT different sorts of models that are emerging, such as software as a service. There is a little bit more supplemental information in the agenda package for this in Exhibit C. On January 11th, 2023, the Commission approved increases to the delegated contracting authority for our executive director, as well as improved increases to the dollar thresholds for reporting to you. So you'll also see some revisions in the proposed CRB rules that will update those thresholds to track with those changes from the Commission Policy 6.1 that were approved and effective in January of 2023. And lastly, there are some revisions that will clarify roles and responsibilities, update formatting, and grammar. So with that, I'm going to pause before we go to the formal vote. Any questions or comments?
Commissioner Johnson.
Thank you. Good clarity. For CRB rule number 8.8, that feels like some flexibility around sole source. Just for IT and software, was there no other part of the business considered for what I would consider to be a sole source opportunity, especially in the operations in the marine space?
Certainly, great question. There are a number of other rules in the existing contract review board rules that do allow for some of those unique circumstances, like when servicing equipment or in continuing on some certain activities, legal activities, marketing activities that have some expertise rooted in that. So those are going to stand as is in the contract review board rules. What you see with 8.8 is just that we needed to do an update because there's been a shift in technology. Disruptive technology has brought forth new models. And so from a decade ago, our rules were just a little bit lacking in modernity. So.
I want to make a comment first because you're going to be part of my comment, and then you might jump in. It's fascinating to see the changes in the state contracting rules because we started working on this when I was still the director at DAS. And this was a priority for the Governor's Racial Justice Council, which Commissioner Alexander, I believe you sat on. And one of the key drivers was the fact that for small women and minority-owned businesses, trying to get through the state contracting process and compete on an RFP was incredibly challenging. And so a lot of interest in trying to simplify, streamline, raise those thresholds that could really help our smaller business, our women and minority-owned business. So it's exciting to see it having passed the legislature. And I know Commissioner Alexander, being on the Racial Justice Council, you were probably engaged in a lot of those conversations.
Yeah, I also am very encouraged by this. I did have one question under the port contracting rules, the decision to rescind the escrow hold. I'm curious. I mean, typically outside of this room, you tend to think of escrow as a protection, more than anything else. And curious as to how frequently that occurred in our contracting, or how many dollars we're talking about. I'm trying to balance administrative ease with exposure.
You know, I'm thinking maybe someone in the room, I'll try to take a stab at this, but from anecdotally what I've heard is that it was hard to establish those escrowed accounts. I think the port was doing a really great job with that. But the contractor community wasn't finding as much benefit to holding it in an escrow account. So there's still going to be a process of withholding those funds, but it would be more the revisions further go on to give further options for bonding. So it does balance out. I think it's just the revision was to take out the maybe clunkiness of the escrow account.
Any other questions for Kendall? All right, Commission, we're going to take two actions. As a commission, we're going to approve the proposed contracting rule amendments, and then we will recess and come to order as the Port of Portland Contract Review Board to approve those contract review board rules. So first, as the commission, can I get a motion and a second for approval of the executive director's recommendation on the Port of Portland contracting rules?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. The Board of Commissioners will be in recess briefly, and the Port of Portland Contract Review Board is now called to order. I'd like a motion and a second for approval of the executive director's recommendation to adopt the resolutions. In favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We've closed the Port of Portland Contract Review Board and come back to, I did that all wrong in my legalese, come back as a commission. And if I could indulge you for just a minute, we have an audience guest who wanted to make a comment, a brief public comment about the economic outlook presentation that Josh Leaner made. We don't typically do this, but we'll make an exception this time. So Frank Hildebrandt, would you like to come forward? Yes, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Kendall.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thanks, Kendall.
So I've written something a little off the cuff. I want to take a quick opportunity, to thank you all. You've been very patient. How am I doing here? Am I good? That sounds really loud from here.
Will you introduce yourself, Frank?
Yeah, my name is Frank Hildebrandt, and I am a business representative with Teamsters Local 305 here in the Portland metropolitan area. Along with Local 206, we have collective bargaining agreements for well over 3,000 people that work here around port properties. So I'm going to go through, I just wrote some stuff again. I want to be very respectful of your time. So standard parking, everybody who drives a bus is a Teamster. Toyota, everybody who works on Toyotas is a Teamster. AWC, same. Daimler, same. UPS, DHL, American Airlines, all the car rental services, including Avis Budget, Hertz, and Enterprise. So those are our big groups, but it's not limited to that. I just can't think of all of them. Now, plus, they belong to Local 206. So, and in particular, American Airlines is just counter. It's the counter folks. I would like to take you back to one of the original slides from Mr. Leonard's presentation, something that concerned me. And I'd like to ask for you all to give it some consideration relative to wage rates that are what we would consider by some employers to be substandard. And I think you would probably agree that that is the case. The CPI that was a premise for inflationary pressures
as described by Mr. Leonard, what was not included was food and energy. I don't know if you happen to notice that. But I think when we talk about the exclusion of food and energy, you're talking about groceries, tanks of gas, and the heat bill. That's real money for people that work at Hertz, at Avis, at Enterprise, Alamo National. I would ask you to turn your attention to your commitment regarding shared prosperity and join me in doing what we can as people who can make decisions that benefit others and move economic prosperity forward deeply and widely for everyone, that we have the opportunity to discuss that, to talk about it, not be afraid to talk about it. That's something I'd like to do, and I know historically the port has been extraordinarily open-minded and welcoming and professional in its conversations with the Teamsters. So I personally appreciate in my work as a business agent, the perspective and support of the port, state of Oregon, with respect to certain employers here. And I would ask you, if you have the opportunity, to go take a look at the QTA, go take a look at some of the mechanics, go ask folks that are working for very successful multinational companies, how are you doing? Can you afford a house? Can you afford your heat bill? Is your ability to go to the grocery store been affected? And we won't even get into the real issues of healthcare costs and retirement. So I ask you to join us in an effort to provide certain components, certain areas that need your focus and legitimate concern for real people with real concerns who make their living here at the port. And I ask that you give some consideration to the exclusion of those two very important considerations and and the premise with respect to inflation and how things look. I have 3 contracts coming open. I have one open now currently with Avis Budget. I won't get into the details of that currently, but I will say that their starting rate is no good, and we'll be moving forward in a way that we see as necessary to move forward. We then have Hertz.
Frank, I hate to interrupt you, but for sake of consistency, you were over 2 minutes.
So Hertz, and then after that, Alamo National. Thank you. Thank you for your time. That'll be occurring over the summer, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry, but I just wrote down this speech as I was here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, commissioners, any last comments, questions? If not, have a great month, and we'll see you in May. Meeting is adjourned.
Sorry.